When games choose classic literature as their source material, it seems to add a false sense of depth. Dante's Inferno took the works of Dante Alighieri and turned it into a brawler, which is about as painfully far from the source material as one could possibly get. That game wasn't some deep philosophical exploration, and neither is Spec Ops: The Line. Don't get me wrong, it could have been, and I'm sure one day a game will adapt a novel and will actually want to play it, but Spec Ops makes too many mistakes as a game and as a narrative to be considered excellent in either category. There's been a lot of bloating about Spec Ops' Heart of Darkness inspired story. While Joseph Conrad's novel does serve as inspiration, it does so in a very roundabout way. There is a bit of history here, so fasten your seatbelts. In the late 70s, Francis Ford Coppola took Conrad's tale of human duality and adapted it into Apocalypse Now, a Vietnam War film. Apocalypse Now and Heart of Darkness are as different as it can be in terms of content and setting, but they do share the same basic themes. Coppola took these themes and used them to tell a story about war and its unforgiving cost, something that Heart of Darkness does not touch upon. So truly, Spec Ops: The Line shares more in common with Apocalypse Now than the film's source material, Heart of Darkness. Don't get me wrong, Spec Ops does do a couple things right, and basing its narrative on a war film, because it is a war game, was definitely a step in the right direction. As a game, Spec Ops is mechanically very weak. It's a squad-based shooter, and while you might expect that to involve some strategy or tactics, you're probably wrong. Playing as Captain Walker, you have two options for your two artificially controlled allies. You can get them to focus fire on a target, or to use stun grenades. The ability to direct their attention was itself somewhat decent, but the charm of this dissolves as soon as you realize just how stupid their AI actually is. The companions will often stand out in the open getting shot, or run around in circles while you try and take on the masses by yourself. The opportunity to direct their movement would have been gratefully appreciated. The stun command, which also would have been a nice feature if it worked properly, unfortunately doesn't. It can only be used sporadically when a prompt appears, oftentimes when it would be completely useless, like right after I've killed every enemy in the area. The cover system is another point of dissension. It would have been a marvel back in the days of Rainbow Six, Vegas, and Gears of War, but advances in third-person shooters have left Spec Ops old and clunky. The cover system is far from intuitive, and you will often see yourself playing the game akin to a first-person shooter, using your duck to get behind cover rather than actually using the terrible cover system. The guns are based on true-to-life weapons, and there's nothing wrong with that, but they're awfully boring and don't hold a candle to the stuff we're used to with games like Call of Duty or Ghost Recon. There's a lot of sand in the game, and the shit is everywhere. Spec Ops uses it in a novel and interesting way. When you shoot a glass barrier holding back a torrent of sand, it rushes into the environment to bury enemies and bridge the distance to high ground. Really, it's just an extension of the age-old exploding barrel. Graphically, Spec Ops is a pretty mixed bag. The environments are surprisingly fantastic. The game's desert setting could have featured a really bland palette, but the developers managed to keep things varied and colorful. The game's locations have a remarkable sense of atmosphere. The character models, however, do leave a lot to be desired. They're stiff, and they look like they could be made of cheap plastic. Spec Ops features a multiplayer with some very Call of Duty-esque progression, and while the design of the multiplayer is up to snuff, the game's garbage cover system makes the multiplayer a poor competitor to games like Ghost Recon Future Soldier. Spec Ops features a lot of licensed music, and surprisingly, it all works really well. When the game was pulling me out of my immersion with a ridiculous body count and silly enemies that would run 100 feet to try and knife me, the music pulled me back into the game and put a smile across my face. Choice is a big selling point for Spec Ops: The Line. The game presents morally gray, one or the other scenarios for you to weigh in on. While they do communicate the game's themes effectively, they are extremely shallow in execution. When you make a choice, you are presented with a superficial scene that has absolutely no bearing upon the gameplay and will not ripple throughout the game. In modern gaming, we expect to see choice take effect in our game worlds. The Witcher, for instance, often has us choose one girl over another. Once that choice is made, there are consequences, and we have to deal with that throughout our experience. The element of choice we see in Spec Ops: The Line is as deep as the last generation of consoles. It does not impress. What is more unsettling are the choices that the game does not give you. It's disturbing that the game will feature linear progression during parts of the narrative that should be affording you choice. It's picky and choosy, and the choices I did make didn't actually have any effect on the game. Spec Ops does allow you to choose one of 4 endings. Unfortunately, they all suck really bad, and the grandiose themes the game has been trying to convey fall apart for the sake of a ridiculous twist. Spec Ops: The Line was in development for far too long. The clunky and outdated game is no match for the current shooter market, and their narrative fails to give you the choices that have any actual impact. For a better story-based third-person shooter, hit up Mass Effect 2. It shines everywhere Spec Ops doesn't. Stay tuned to myetdmedia.com for more reviews, previews, and in-depth retrospectives.